Buddy, I'm back, and I just want to apologize for not reading like I told you I would this summer. And I've just been super busy. I'm moving. I've been on vacation. I'm enjoying my summer, But I wanted to come back and read more I Survived because I haven't in a while, and I really miss y'all. And I miss doing this. This was something really fun that I started doing, and I feel bad that I stopped. So we are gonna go ahead and jump right in. This time, Miss Gusler was smart and put a bookmark in, so I didn't even have to go back to my YouTube to figure out where I was. So we are at chapter 9. I'm not gonna lie, I don't really know what happened in the past chapters because it's been so long, but if you want to know, go back to my other YouTube videos and you can listen through the whole I Survived so far from chapters 1 to 8. So here we go, chapter 9. Paul let go of Nate and stepped back. His smile had fallen away. Now his expression was almost angry, like Nate had hurt him somehow. I sent you at least 10 letters, Paul said. I rode in a wagon for 2 days to get to your uncle's house. And when I got there, he told me you wouldn't see me. He slammed the door right in my face. Nate stood there in shock. Storch was a lying, evil rat. He made Nate believe that his only friend in the world had forgotten about him. Tears burned Nate's eyes. I didn't know, he said, barely choking out the words. Paul looked surprised at first, but his eyes drifted down to Nate's neck, which still hurt from Storch's strangling attack. Paul's face turned white. Where did you get those bruises? He said, softly. Did he... Nate hadn't seen himself in a mirror, but from Paul's horrified expression, Nate realized he must look worse than he imagined. Those angry bruises told Paul everything he needed to know about life with Storch. Good Lord, Nate, Paul whispered. If I had known. Nate looked away so Paul wouldn't see his tears, but Paul was crying too. And anyway, Nate wasn't crying about Storch. He wouldn't waste a tear on that snake-hearted beast. Nate was crying because he let himself lose faith in Paul. Neither cried for long. Paul put his hands on Nate's shoulders. He leaned close. Well, he said, we found each other, didn't we? They sat down in a shady spot near the tents. Paul peeled off his ugly green hat and placed it carefully on the ground. My lucky charm, he said. Nate tried not to stare at Paul, but he kept thinking of the devilish teenager who clowned around on Papa's ships. He'd sneak vinegar into the men's canteens. He taught the ship's parrot to cuss in French. Nobody drove Papa and his men crazier or made them laugh harder. But now Paul's eyes looked serious and thoughtful. He listened closely as Nate told him about Storch and how Eliza and Theo had become family to him. He explained how he'd fled from Storch and had hoped to find a job on a ship. Paul shook his head. Hardly any ships coming or going from New York City these days. The British attack is coming any day. British warships had been streaming into the harbor all month, Paul said. Each one was packed tight with redcoats. There were hundreds of ships already and tens of thousands of soldiers. The ships were anchored about 8 miles from here, off Staten Island. Those 2 warships today gave us just a little hint of what's to come, Paul said. They just wanted to give us a little scare and catch us by surprise. Next time we'll be ready. Paul told Nate that he'd been in the army for more than 18 months and stationed here in New York City since May. Before that, he'd been living on his family's farm in northern Connecticut. I figured you'd gone back to sea, Nate said. Paul shook his head, and a shadow passed across Paul's face. I couldn't even look at the ocean not after. Nate finished the sentence in his mind. After we lost Papa. He and Nate were quiet for a moment, and then Paul went on. He told Nate about his life on the farm and how he loved being with his parents, but had nearly gone crazy with boredom. The chickens never laughed at my jokes, he said. Paul wanted an adventure. He thought about heading west to the wilds of Ohio. But then, in April of 1775, everything changed. That was when the first battle broke out between British and American troops in and around the Massachusetts towns of Lexington and Concord. The Revolutionary War had begun. Within a week, Paul had joined the fight. I had no idea what it meant to be a soldier, Paul said. The first time I fired a musket, I almost blew off my hand. He held at his thumb. It looked like the tip had been gnawed off by a barracuda. Paul chuckled. But I had to learn pretty quick, Paul said. Serious again. That's because about 7 weeks later, he found himself at the bloody Battle of Bunker Hill. I almost didn't make it out of that one alive, he said quietly. And then Paul told Nate the story of how he almost died on a hill outside of Boston. All right, this is chapter 10, but I got to turn on this fan above me because I am hot. Hold on. And I'm back. And it's on, as you can see. Okay. It's hot in this room. And I have my light shining on me, so it's even hotter. Whew. All right. Feels better already. Chapter 10. It was 2 months after Lexington and Concord in June 1775, Paul began. Almost exactly 1 year ago. I marched from Connecticut to Boston with about 20 other men from my town. It took a week, 100 miles. My feet nearly fell off. They joined about 2,000 other American soldiers camped outside of Boston. Boston was the headquarters for the British Army in America, Paul explained. There were 6,000 redcoats stationed there, and they'd taken over the city. The people of Boston were like prisoners. British soldiers moved into any house they wanted. There wasn't enough food. Shops were shut down. It was so bad. We had to do something to get the British out. There was no American army yet, but each town in the colonies had a militia, a small group of volunteer fighters. Few of those men had never fought before in a war. We were all just regular fellows, farmers, bakers, shoe keepers, shoemakers. I'm going to go back on that one. Farmers, bakers, shopkeepers. I get a call in the middle of the video. Okay. So I'm going to start this whole sentence over again. We were all just regular fellows. Farmers, bakers, shoe keepers, shoemakers, sailors. Some of us didn't even know how to shoot. And this ragtag group was about to battle the most powerful army in the world. Paul and the other men knew all about the redcoats. They were experienced fighters. The British carried modern muskets, and their muskets had extra killing power. A sharp sword attached to the end. A bayonet. We heard that the British shoot first, and if you don't die from a musket ball to your gut, they'll finish you off with a quick stab in the heart with a bayonet. Nate flinched. The night before the battle, the Americans had been warned that thousands of British troops were on their way. Paul spent the night in frantically helping to build, I gotta sound this word out, fortifications, dirt walls and ditches that could protect them from musket fire. I just learned a new word, fortifications. And we worked all night, he said. And then just after dawn, the British attacked. We could hear them before we could see them, Paul said. Their battle drums make a terrible sound. Paul leaned forward. His voice dropped to a husky whisper. Rat, tat, tat, tat. Rat, tat, tat, tat. Rat, tat, tat, tat. The hairs on the back of Nate's neck stood up. Then came cannon explosions. British warships had sailed into the river below us and were blasting us with non-stop cannonballs. I was in one of the big ditches, a trench. Somehow a big rock had gotten into my boot. I bent down to get it out, and the second I lowered my head, something huge went screaming over. A cannonball? Nate gasped. At least a 20-pounder, Paul said. It knocked off my hat. Could have taken off my head. He patted the ugly green hat next to him. I always knew this was my lucky hat. I never go anywhere without it. Paul took a deep breath. I was terrified. I just wanted to run away. But you didn't run, Nate guessed. No, Paul said. It's amazing that none of us did. We were high up on that hill, Paul went on. That's always where you want to be in a battle, on the high ground. It's easier to knock out your enemies when they are coming up a hill. And we were dug in, protected by our dirt walls and trenches. The drums got louder. The British Army appeared, 4,000 redcoat soldiers marching in endless lines. They started up the hill. But we didn't shoot. Our plan was to wait until the British were close enough to see their eyes. Remember, the whites in their eyes. And then we'd all shoot at once. The British came closer. Finally, the order came. Fire! Kyak, kyak, crack, crack. Thousands of musket balls through the air. Hundreds of redcoats fell. We Americans ducked behind our defenses and reloaded. Then we fired again. Crack, 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 crack. The redcoats sent up 3 waves of soldiers, and then the battle was over. Paul took a deep breath like he'd been running. Nate's own heart was pounding. It took him a moment to remember that they weren't on that bloody hill outside of Boston. They were in a New York City sitting together in grass. So you won the battle? Nate asked excitedly. No, Paul said. You lost? Nate asked confused. Not really. We ran out of gunpowder. We had to retreat. Skate back end of the hill. We didn't free Boston, so no, we definitely didn't win. But we didn't lose either. More than 1,000 redcoats were killed or hurt that day. We lost about 300, not nearly as many as we thought we would. But there was more. And we showed that the Americans are willing to fight the most powerful army in the world. We showed that we can hold our ground. As Paul kept talking, Nate realized how much he didn't know about the war. Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill had just been the beginning. The Americans had lost a big battle up in Quebec, Canada. But they beat the British in a fight down in South Carolina. And this past March, the Americans finally drove the British out of Boston. And then came the most shocking news. America wasn't just a part of England anymore. Not really. Just last week, on July 4th, 1776, leaders of the American colonies signed a letter to King George. It had an important sounding name. The Declaration of Independence. Our captain read it to us a few nights ago. I can't remember the fancy words, but basically it said that the American colonies are joining together to make a brand new country, a free country, the United States of America. That's what this war is about. We are fighting for our new country. And the biggest battle was about to happen right here in New York. Paul leaned forward, his eyes flickered with excitement. So you'll join us? The army? Nate asked. Now Paul had to be kidding. Or crazy. Nate couldn't fight in a war. He was only 11 years old. But Paul was dead serious. And he wasn't saying Nate should be a soldier. He'd have to be at least 14 for that. I need to talk to the captain, Paul said. He's been looking for a camp helper. He'd let me stay here? Nate asked. I bet he would. Nate thought of what Papa used to say as they would stand together on the deck of his ship, looking out over the ocean. You never know what's ahead. Papa was right. Barely a day ago, Nate had been running for his life. And now here he was with his oldest friend in the world. He was going to be a part of George Washington's army. Nate barely realized that he was smiling and nodding. Looks like your answer is yes, Paul said. So I'm going to stop there, and I promise I will be back next week because I am moving officially out of Houston tomorrow, or this week. So I will definitely be back next week to read you 2 more chapters. I'll read 11 and 12 and maybe even more. So see y'all guys then. Bye.